Hi, Kirk.
Hi, Serge. Great to see you.
Yeah, same here. Same here. And so, um, today we're going to be talking about anxiety and how we handle the many dimensions of our anxiety.
Yes, well, that is the core of my study of late and my book,
Yeah.
Enhancing Anxiety. So I guess you're leaving that open as a
Well, I
question.
could either, I mean, maybe the concept is really that sense of how we tend to run away from anxiety as something undesirable.
Yeah.
And your approach is actually by doing that, we throw the baby with the bathwater. And
Yes.
um,
Well, yeah, I think so much of it really goes back to our primal encounter with anxiety. And even more than that, our encounter with difference, that which is different from us. Uh, Differences between ourselves and other people, uh, between ourselves and other places, other things, and even differences in ourselves that come up at the point of birth, actually. I'm very sympathetic with Otto Rank's idea of the trauma of birth. Although I wouldn't call it the trauma of birth, I would call it the drama of birth because I don't think it's just trauma, shock, and terror. I think that's a big part of what happens when we move from a place of relative non-being and unity to sudden abrupt being and pandemonium.
mhm, mhm.
And I do think that kind of sets the template for future anxiety, trauma, etc. And that has so much to do with, as Rank so well puts it, the psychology of difference. There is such a radical difference that happens in that birth process and being thrown into the radically unknown.
Yeah, yeah.
Yeah.
And the context essentially is that our mind is equipped to deal with unity or simplicity. And
Yes,
when we introduce complexity,
yes,
then we introduce anxiety because that's something that's not immediately obvious to our mind
yes.
to handle.
Right, right. I mean, we're basically in a passive receptive mode, and then suddenly we're thrown into this wildness and lack of control without any equipment.
Hmm.
We have to learn the equipment, learn how to work with it. Uh, so difference is a huge challenge. And I don't think we're often very good at supporting this radical encounter with otherness and with difference, either in the parental matrix, if you will, or the culture that surrounds the parents. We come at difference too often with fear, sometimes carried
Hmm.
over generation after generation, and even subconscious fears of
Yeah.
that which is different, that which is other.
And so, in a way, from having that the beginning, you mentioned how it starts at birth. And so that sense of difference is not an intellectual construct. It's not, oh, this is different. Uh, but difference is the experience of being shot into a world that you can no longer make sense of.
Yes, yes. No, it's very much a whole body experience. And I call it a sense of helplessness and groundlessness
Hmm.
we experience from the get-go. There's a real floundering there, coupled with a growing element of wonder and discovery also. And that's why I call it a drama of birth, as
Hmm.
distinct from trauma, because uh, my sense of birth, it's hard to remember exactly, but it was reinforced by actually witnessing the birth of my son. I was right there as part of the delivery of him. He was like shocked and jarred at first, stunned, seemed overwhelmed by the difference of what he was thrown into. But very soon after that, there was like a looking around and a curiosity, and I think that's really kind of the crucible that we're dealing with here. How do we help people to come into that place of more curiosity, intrigue, discovery, as distinct from doing everything we can to avoid that which is other and different, and thereby, unfortunately, living often a fairly narrow life, or a superficial life, or a very destructive life, because we're so frustrated by feeling so helpless and groundless that we have to pump ourselves up and make ourselves great, quote unquote, in some way. Actually often ends up more like tyrannical or devaluing of other people, just so we can avoid that primal sense of groundlessness and helplessness, because we have not really been met and supported.
I want to maybe invite you to stay a little longer with that experience of groundlessness,
Sure.
so that it's not abstract. And
Yes.
in some ways, it evokes for me the notion of emptiness in Buddhism. But the notion of emptiness is not, necessarily emptiness how we understand it, but is the fact that nothing exists in and of itself. And
Right.
your groundlessness, you have an image that you mentioned from Mad Men. That might,
Yes, that's right. Well, yeah, Mad Men and Hitchcock's Vertigo,
mm-hmm,
where the protagonist is spiraling in midair, spiraling into the void. um, in Mad Men, it's the protagonist, played by John Hamm, at the beginning in the credits. I mean, you see a silhouette of him, so almost cartoon-like. But what you see is a male figure, like in a free fall, spiraling into, we don't know what, into the void. But he has a total lack of control in that spiraling process. And of course, that conjures up all kinds of images and projections and possibilities, but it's so reflective of that guy's struggle. It's a very existential struggle in that program, I believe,
mm-hmm, mm-hmm.
between the illusion of power and control, which is all about him in the advertising business, and even in much of his life at that time, through having a lot of women and being sort of a cool cat. But underneath, he's just terrified, and he's just floundering, in that unknown, and attempting to, in some way, address that through the series.
Yeah, yeah, yeah. So that experience of groundlessness is throughout his life, he tries to avoid it and finds ways
Yes.
in which he seems to have control. But
Yes,
then it
that's right.
comes up, and when it comes up, it's not just a concept. It's so terrifying that, it's just essentially that free fall.
Yes, he's searching for an identity in a sense too.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
Very clearly lacks an identity in many ways in that story, or he holds on to pseudo identities that aren't really rooted in what deeply matters to him. And that's a lot of what we're talking about too. It's
Yeah, yeah. And so to play
being
devil's
able,
advocate, to play devil's advocate, taking his role, he'd turn to you and say, well, why would I, welcome the anxiety? Why don't I just try to hang on more firmly to what you call my pseudo identity? Who would want, to get in free fall like that?
That's the question I have to respond to all the time. Why should I have to struggle with that anxiety and that free fall when I have all these instant answers, whether it's sex or drugs or an ideology I can cling to? Simple answer.
Mm-hmm.
My response is that, well, how do you want to live your life? How is that working out for you? And clearly in the show, it's not working too well. I mean, at the surface level, yeah, he's a handsome guy. He's doing great, with women and his status in the Madison Avenue world. But underneath, is he really living the kind of life he wants to lead? I don't think so. So this gets to the question of, are people willing to do the inner work necessary to live a fuller, more gratifying life in the long term, not just, in the short term with quick fixes, which our society is just, riven with. That's not an easy challenge for people to
Yeah.
accept that it takes some inner work to begin to come to terms with that terror of that which is other and radically unknown.
Mm-hmm, mm-hmm. But so in doing that, there is we shift the terrain from on the one hand, the question is, well, why would I have the terror? Am I not better if I avoid the terror?
Right.
And then the answer is, but long term, you're better off once you have confronted it.
I would say long term, and also in terms of your whole body experience of living.
Mm-hmm.
If your whole body is not connected with where you're going in your life, what kind of a life is it? Maybe it's a very partial life. Again, you're doing well on the surfaces, but are you really leading the kind of life you want to live? And do you feel the freedom to really explore that? That's part of the problem here too, is if you're doing everything you can to avoid the anxiety of uncomfortable ideas, uncomfortable conversations, uncomfortable relationships, are you able to really explore, let alone pursue, what deeply matters to you?
Mm-hmm, mm-hmm, mm-hmm. And maybe, of course, you and I agree on the value of confronting the anxiety. And you and I agree that finding good therapy is certainly one way to do that, not necessarily the only way or not necessarily sufficient by itself, but certainly a very good avenue.
Yes.
So yes, we obviously have a bias there. We have an opinion there.
Experience. In my case,
yes, no,
I've had direct experience with it. It helped. It saved my life, I feel.
But maybe coming back to that experience, that sense of, it's not just, and actually I like the fact that you mentioned your direct experience. This is not just, but it was not a place of you saying, I took myself up by my bootstraps and did it. But it was you being lucky enough to have the right help and support that was both competent and available.
Yes, that's extremely right, and I've been extremely blessed to have had that support, both psychologically minded parents, even though they were very understandably shattered after the trauma of the death of my brother, and I was very young. but still very psychologically minded, and had the wherewithal to send me to a child analyst, who I describe in the book, who presented a model for me of somebody who seemed to have really been through a lot in his life, very seasoned. And yet here he was, he survived. And not only survived, but thrived. I mean, he was a whole person in my very young mind in experiencing him. But he was definitely a model. And that helped me internalize a different relationship to myself, because the relationship that I went into that analysis with was very overwhelming. It was life-denying anxiety, not life-enhancing. And by the way, what I mean by life-enhancing anxiety is the capacity to live with and make the best of the depth and mystery of existence.
Mm-hmm.
So I was horrified by the depth and mystery of existence, and I had all kinds of ways of defending against it, with rages and withdrawals and just night terrors that kept me basically paralyzed in a lot of ways. And so I think so much of the healing had to do with my absorption of his modeling and holding the most radical ranges of my thoughts, feelings, sensations, fantasies, and internalizing that. So I was in effect internalizing a much more supportive and centered relationship
Mm-hmm.
with
Mm-hmm.
my anxiety.
Yeah, yeah. And so, we're talking about the depth of and mystery of existence.
Yes.
To the child you were then, even if you could understand fancy words like depth and mystery of existence,
Right.
this was nothing like your experience.
Right. That's right.
And so what was crucial was to have somebody who was the embodiment of having faced it
Yes. Yes.
and would be able to say, I'm with you and we're
Yes.
going to get through it. And
Yes.
there's something to hope for.
Yes. Right. Right. Gave me hope too, and a permission to range within or roam within, which
Mm-hmm.
I didn't feel at all. Again, I was basically in a state of overwhelm and paralysis.
Yeah, yeah. And so we're
Scared.
talking about trauma. And as you pointed out, it's not necessarily that trauma is condemned to stay trauma, but it can be drama from which once you digest it,
Yes.
something more evolve. And so we can call it resilience, or we can call it ability to stay with the depth and mystery of existence.
Or eventually the cultivation of the sense of awe toward
Yeah,
living, the
yeah,
humility and wonder,
yeah.
the capacity to be with my vulnerable parts, if you will, as well as incremental risk taking and venturing out, risking with him, with my analyst, in our relationship, risking by identifying feelings, by exploring feelings. All of that was part of that expansion that I think you're talking about.
Yeah, yeah. Yeah. So you mentioned the notion of awe, and so awe is something that falls within the sphere of spirituality, and
Yeah.
we as therapists often shy away from there because spirituality evokes something that might be more like dogma, might be more like a belief system, might seem like it's infringing on what our clients might do, and you're championing the notion of awe and spirituality as
Yeah.
something that's a function of being human.
Yes, yes. And I would distinguish between spirituality and religion. I think religion comes more with that loading of dogma, of codification, absolutisms, where spirituality, I believe, is more open-ended. I mean, the spirituality that I embrace, describe in the book, is what I call enchanted agnosticism.
I love that phrase. You know, the phrase I use is thinking about I'm an agnostic mystic, or so
Uh-huh.
that same
Yeah, yeah,
that same dichotomy, but that enriches each other while breaking away from the original notion of spirituality.
yeah. Well, I think it's the best of spirituality. It's the best of religiosity, in my view. Is all the great religions point to that. To be able to uh, feel like you're participating in something much greater than yourself, and thereby be lifted by that larger identification. It's one of the greatest feelings one can have, I think. And it also, but it's especially a great feeling if one can have an inner freedom around that to reflect deeply and from one's core sense what deeply matters about my life and the lives that are around that surround me.
Mm-hmm, mm-hmm, mm-hmm.
Um, it enables one to come at those bigger questions with greater ability to well to feel that one can deal with those questions rather than being in a panic about it and resorting to something, a quick fix kind of thing.
Yeah.
Whether that's a certain notion of God, let's say, or something from scripture that again may be useful, but is sought after more by panic and fear than by pausefulness and deliberation with one's whole body experience.
Yeah, yeah. So the paradigm we're talking about is the paradigm of having a role model, a mentor,
Yeah.
somebody uh,
Yes.
who would embody the possibility of staying with that frightening groundlessness,
Yes.
is that mystery, um,
Yes.
but see the possibility of containing it,
Yes. Right.
so that containing it and staying with it allows for something to emerge. And we're talking about growth, not as some kind of a cliche of, oh, you do this, you do therapy, you do personal growth, but growth that comes from handling that complexity.
Yeah. Yeah. It's it's growth without an external blueprint.
Mm-hmm.
Uh, it's a blueprint that comes from our own inner searching, our own uh, grappling with how best to live. And I think that's bound to bring up questions about about ethics, about living collectively, not just individually.
Mm-hmm.
Um, because the more consciousness, the more you're conscious of other people as well, and of the pain and challenge of living in the world.
Yeah, yeah. So that's a very different image from, say, the stereotype of, oh, if you pay attention to your inner experience, you're diving into a well of just deeper and deeper into yourself and cut off from the world. But what you're talking about is, realizing that something larger, the larger world, means dealing with the interaction.
Yes, and it means recognizing the preciousness of life. Um, the amazement that we're here,
Mm-hmm.
and just even beginning with that, uh, you don't want to degrade yourself or others, or degrade the experience, or skim the surface of it. Generally, I think it really prompts you to want to seize life, and um, attempt to live the best life you can, to celebrate life as much as you can.
Yeah, and so this is where there is a meeting point with the notions of positive psychology and happiness, but also a divergence, because you're talking about what makes a good life in a much larger sense
Yeah.
than just necessarily the conventional meaning of being happy.
Yeah, I'm really talking about an ability to recognize, well, the whole question of what is deeply moving to one. Seems to me it's hard to be deeply moved by something unless there is a specter of death, anxiety, uh, great humility about our vulnerability before the vastness of creation. And this is, I mean, I think that's what brings up the poignancy of life, of whether it's in a relationship with somebody, a project, um, ideas. One of my concerns with some of the recent writings about positive psychology, and even longer term writings, but even some of the work on awe coming from that positive psychology standpoint, is that they seem to want to separate the sense of awe, uh, which they would equate maybe more with wonder and joy of living, completely separated from uh, the trembling elements of living, the unsettling, the uncomfortable. Uh, Even in, for example, Dr. Keltner's recent book on awe,
Mm-hmm.
very explicitly places the themes of fear and horror and anxiety and death completely separate from what he characterizes as a sense of awe, based on statistical surveys of people describing their sense of awe, quantitative experimental research. And I think that's part of the problem, is they're not digging deep enough. They're not reflecting the entire literary, artistic, and in many ways spiritual traditions that acknowledge the tragic dimension of living as integral to living a fuller, more vital life.
Yeah, yeah. So what
And a
comes to
sense of
mind?
awe. Yeah,
What
go
comes
ahead.
to mind, talk about this is the idea of an amateur mechanic who takes, pieces by piece, his engine and then puts it back together and say, oh, look, there's 5 pieces that are absolutely unnecessary. And, and so you're a seasoned mechanic and you look at it and say, well, if they were put here, you're going to have a problem at some point if you remove them.
Uh-huh. Right, right.
You take life and humanity and you remove some essential components, but we could probably live without it.
It's not complete. It's not a fuller experience. I mean, we can also go back to Rudolf Otto, the idea of the holy. I mean, the core religious experience for him is the mysterium tremendum and the fascinating.
Mm-hmm.
That's the beginning. That's the core, the seed. He calls that the numinous, right? But it starts with a shaking and a quailing before the vastness of existence, and that's integral
Yeah,
to the fuller experience of that existence,
yeah.
along with the fascinating. You begin to wonder, be curious about it, discover, and be creative within it. But it comes with the trembling and the humility
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
that are so integral to being moved by this life.
And I want to bring that, to attach, to connect that vision, that mystical vision, if you want, to the very down-to-earth experience of
Yeah.
what we and people can experience in therapy. And I want to quote something that you were saying a bit earlier. And you're talking about having both the experience of vulnerability and the experience of being part of something larger. And
Yes,
and that, and so it's not one or the other.
that's
uh,
right.
and the two really feed into each other, and that's what the experience is. You cannot reduce it to just one side or the other. They go hand in hand.
They do, because all the so-called dysphoric or negative feelings are paradoxical. They are openings to new sensitivities and ways of feeling and thinking about oneself and the world, as well as they can be prisms and closings
Mm-hmm.
of our lives. Uh, you just take fear or depression itself. I mean, certainly that can be crippling and overwhelming. But also, if it's stayed with and worked with, it can also bring up new sensitivities toward oneself, toward others that one didn't have before. Maybe a recognition of the preciousness of life or of a certain relationship you had. Can deepen one's feelings of love, perhaps,
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
as one is so affected by the relationship.
Yeah.
So, yes, I'm very much with what you're saying. I think good depth experiential therapy is really the staging grounds for cultivating a sense of awe toward living, because we're shifting back and forth between abject terror and paralysis often to gradual incremental intrigue, even if that intrigue has to do with uh, seeing something new by expressing your despair or your anger with your therapist, let's say. So gradual intrigue, curiosity, and hopefully eventually fascination and a whole new path toward living.
Yeah. Yeah.
We feel
including the
free to
possibility
pursue.
of including the possibility of taking risks.
Yes,
And I'm not talking about major risk necessarily. It could be little
right.
risk in experimenting, so that there is the possibility of experiencing at the same time the terror, but
That's right.
also the possibility of taking risks and having a chance to see something emerge.
That's right. I mean, I think it's similar to how our eyes gradually can adjust to the threatening, uh, strange experience of being in, let's say, a dark basement,
Mm.
and there are objects jutting out, and they seem terrifying. They're like monsters, or they're going to pierce us, or or we're going to be in that free fall we were talking about before. We're going to suddenly step into an abyss and be lost. But if we can stay with it, if we can feel these objects in the basement, we begin to see, that's that wonderful ski pole that I had, right? That I had such a great time with on, Mount Rainier or whatever. Or, that's the table that I had, and that, had such wonderful objects on it. Whatever it is, it's it's a kind of habituation, but it's more than behavioral. It's, again, with one's whole body experience, being able to be more present.
And what I like
In,
in your example is that at first in the dark, there is a separation of me versus everything else, which is threatening.
yes,
And then
yes,
what you're describing is actually, presence, which is a process. It's in process, and it's a process of engagement. And you're describing, say, touching something. Oh, it's a ski pole, and then there's a connection that's being made. So it's really a process of engaging.
it is. It is. And it's a process of stepping outside the box, of taking the risk to stay with
Mm-hmm.
that which appeared harrowing and overwhelming, but is now appearing in a different way.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
Something, the more you're coming into the more of
Yeah.
your being.
And
And
so,
that's
so
really what
that
the
that
process.
that image of that dark cave is fits that notion of, at first, dealing with anxiety. It feels like the only way to do is, somebody please get me out of here, and then with help, with not left to your own devices in something that's too overwhelming, the possibility of gradually engaging with the world and
Yes.
discovering that despite the anxiety, it actually can be a place where it's enjoyable to live in.
Yeah. Not only survivable, but thrivable.
Thrivable.
If I could use that word, make up
Yeah,
that word.
yeah.
But yeah, and that's where our healers, our therapists, or what Alice Miller calls helpful witnesses, might be a caring neighbor, a parent, or in the case of, for example, Maya Angelou, who was raped at 7 years old, it was the local library that provided those helpful witnesses to her,
Mhm.
reading people like Langston Hughes, who related directly to her life, but
Mhm.
presented a model of somebody who not only survived some of the most degrading, bigoted circumstances one could imagine as an African American in America at that time,
Yeah.
and the degradations, but became an artist, became creative out of that and beyond that experience.
Yeah. Yeah. And so we want to be among these helpful witnesses.
Yes, yes. And I think we want to cultivate more and more helpful witnesses. And the only way to do that in the longer term and in a more substantive way is for us to make a major shift frankly, in our socioeconomic system,
Mhm.
our whole culture,
Yeah.
to shift from uh, the quick fix, instant result model for living, which is so seductive and so available now, especially because of our technology, our devices that allow that, to what I would call a slow simmer sense of life, of the amazement of life, the preciousness of this, fleeting moment between two voids that we all have, and thereby a focus on the things that really matter, that more deeply matter, and how to support that in our culture.
And I might put it maybe in a slightly different way, see if we're, but the shift from the immediate result, or a shift from things have to be the way I imagine they should be, to getting more in the process. And either inner process, interpersonal process, discussion, expansion of so that the problem shifts from that place.
Yes. Yeah, and I think what you're saying is a more of a focus on the journey rather than the destination per se.
Yeah.
But to see the journey is amazing.
But to see that the journey itself shapes the destination. It's not a distraction. It's not, oh, I'm giving up on where I want to go. I'm giving up on the result. I'm giving up on, say, economic progress. But that actually the process of it is the way to address it. That's great. Yeah, I love that, because it's a very conscious journey, and it's again a journey with one's whole body experience to the degree possible, so that the destination reflects that whole body experience, right? Reflects something really core, something deeply meaningful. Yeah. Awe-based, if you will. Yeah. In all its dimensions, all the dimensions of all. Right. So this feels like a good place to end, but just want to check if you want to add something. Well, to do all you can to begin to take the mystery of our lives seriously. And by that, I mean, see if you can take more time to be in that unknowing place, to feel what it's like, sense what it's like, allow other feelings, thoughts, associations to come up as you stay in that unknowing, and stay with the process to the degree you can. Also seek a helpful witness if you can help in the process, a Virgil to you being Dante, in a sense. It can be something great to share with a helpful witness, a friend, a lover, what have you. But to discover the riches of that which might feel very threatening and foreign at first, but can be a place or a person of incredible discovery for you, and for what deeply matters about your life and our lives together. And there are many paths to this, right? As we were describing before. Certainly, Buddhism could be part of that, meditation, depth therapy, or something that we didn't really talk about too much, but I've been very involved in, these bridge building dialogues between people of very different political and cultural backgrounds. Intimate one-on-one dialogues that I call experiential democracy dialogue. Mhm.
where it is really so much about cultivating greater presence to oneself and what comes up in oneself, as well as one's experience of the other. And it's coming into that place where you're able to experience otherness less and less by your immediate reaction or the stereotype that you project on the other, but more in terms of their fuller humanity and what you can learn from each other, which I think is the first step toward achieving some kind of common ground or common purpose. We have to learn more about each other's humanity. And I realize it's not for everyone. and some people, that's the last thing that they would want to do. They feel that they may need to make other changes first before they'd sit with somebody in those very intimate ways.
Yeah.
But for those who are willing, and I think there are more and more people willing and interested in finding ways of getting along with each other in a more internal way, not just externally, behaviorally.
Mm-hmm.
Again, with her whole body experience, discovering more about each other. I think it can be a very valuable path for the next step in our democracy, really.
Yeah.
Versus just rearranging deck chairs on a Titanic. You know what I mean?
Yeah. 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 Thanks, Kirk.